You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Gareth Russell. He's one of the most engaging and phenomenal writers I've ever encountered. He came on before to talk about the fizzy life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. But I discovered another one of his books, and it's called The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era. I read it completely ignorant, didn't know anything about the Titanic, save for James Cameron's movie. And it's fascinating. I've gifted it to, I think, at least a half dozen people. So if you want me to buy you a copy of this amazing book, just contact me after listening to this podcast. Gareth, thank you so much for coming on again.
Robert, thank you so much for having me in that very, very kind introduction.
Is the Titanic because I want to get right to it here, is the Titanic a piece of British lore, much like, say, the USS Constitution is in the United States? In other words, it just kind of stands apart, maybe like Nelson's flagship?
Yeah, I think yes, I think it does. Where I would maybe query it is it has sort of become global in a sense. It almost becomes a touchstone. But I think the word lore is sort of perfect, because what the Titanic does is a bit like many of our historical myths. It allows you to tell whatever story you want. It's a bit like Marie Antoinette's Let Them Eat Cake, which is always used to make a point about, being clueless or out of touch, except the Titanic happened. But what I mean is we have these stories where you can touch a certain historical subject and make it more, I don't know if maybe the word's valid or emphatic if you link it to the Titanic. So I do think it has become something much larger in our culture than its parts would suggest, if that makes sense.
So in your pre-Titanic writing career, did you ever say, well, that's just like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic?
Yeah, I think I actually, funnily, right before I came on, I was recording something about the famine in Ireland in the 1840s, and I said the government's response was like trying to put a cork into the side of the Titanic. And yes, I think actually, many, not even, Robert, in like my work every day, rearrange deck chairs in the Titanic is a standard gripe I have if I think that someone's doing something pointless.
Hey, and we'd love to have you on to talk about the supposed potato famine, because there really wasn't.
No, it's interesting. So what we were looking at was that it was the blight, and really that there obviously was a kind of a pebble over the landslide, and then very complicated, but the government's response coupled with the infrastructure, etc. But yeah, that was it was a fascinating thing to look at. I've been looking at Victoria and Belfast for my own podcast, and it was great fun. Also, this was actually to sort of tie in with Titanic. I had the same experience writing this book as doing the episode I was just doing, which is that you when you're walking around your home city and you've been writing about it historically, it's very strange. You start to notice buildings that you were walking past the day before and didn't think anything of, and you notice these places, and that was a comparable experience.
I just remember in college reading, I took a 19th century European history course, and the professor, John Stevens, who's utterly brilliant, but was a huge scholar of Ireland in this time period. And he gave me some firsthand accounts to read about people dying with grass in their mouth.
Yeah.
And just the starvation, and whether there was an actual potato famine or whether it was a government.
Yeah, I think certainly what was interesting. I mean, I was talking to a socialist friend of mine who we were trying. He said, "Look, what is missed is that with the famine in Ireland in the 1840s, a lot of people miss the point because they fall into one of those two camps, and there's a third option, which is almost more bone chilling, which is that the government so halfway through the famine there was a general election in the UK." And the party that came to power, the Whigs, in 1847, were ultra-libertarian. They were sort of like almost fanatically devoted to the government not getting involved in the economy. And one of the knock-on effects of that was that when the other food supplies were dwindling, Irish private companies that owned grain or sort of produced grain were allowed to import it out of the country because they got a higher price that way. And the government just sat back and did nothing. And then there's also the stuff about Trevelyan distributing the government corn in this really horrendous way. I mean, there's just this kind of, absolutely fascinating historiography about it. But I've got friends who are actors in Belfast to read some of the eyewitness accounts, not just about this, but about other events in 19th century Belfast. And it's always, I suppose it's true of any country's history, but you sometimes, they said that when they were reading it, they thought, I just didn't know this. I didn't know all these different things that happened. But that's true of history universally. I think we often, the history that happens on your own doorstep is the one you look over because you're looking into the distance.
It's particularly true in the United States when it comes to, and we'll get back to the Titanic because we could do this all day. We'll end up talking about, the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Yeah. When it comes to Jim Crow history and exactly the treatment of African Americans after World War II, not post-bellum Civil War, but in the last 60 years, in the last generation or two, you just don't know the depth until you read about it, of the discrimination. And when you read things,
right.
For example, in Mississippi in the 1930s, not only was it illegal against state law for white students and black students to use the same textbook, it was illegal to store them in the same room.
See, that's interesting because what I've heard about the way the depth of the racism was evolving was that in the 1930s and 1940s, this, by the way, apparently was particularly true of apartheid in South Africa. They tried to justify it or expand it by using sort of pseudo-medical conspiracy theories that you couldn't have books touching the two races. Yeah, that would make that would make sense with what I've heard of because actually I think what's interesting about racism is that we have this idea that it's getting less over time. And if you look at the 1930s and 1940s, it actually intensifies and takes it on a different hue. It's one of the most bone-chilling things that you read when they start to use these phrases that they deliberately make vaguely scientific, so you think that people at the time thought they made sense, but they're just absolute hogwash. And
you would think that they, American slavery, much like the Holocaust, is its own particular thing. But I would argue that in its own way, the post-bellum and certainly early to mid 20th century Jim Crow status, not only in the South, but in other places, is equally as horrid because you think that we would have known better by now.
So that's interesting, that idea of the changing of mentality, changing the morality. That's really interesting.
When I read your book on the Titanic, as I said, I read it from the standpoint of someone with very little knowledge. And what I enjoyed so much about the book, but is how you painstakingly take the reader through, and not laboriously. It's like a ride. How it's built, why it's built, what's going on in terms of shipbuilding throughout the world at this time. I'm a big fan of the Robert Massey book, Dreadnought, that discusses the Anglo-German naval race of the late 19th and early 20th century. What is happening in the shipbuilding world where it's basically an atmosphere of, I'm going to try to top you?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, look, what's interesting is that the dreadnought race that you mentioned is obviously the military race between the British and German empires. And essentially what's happening in commercial shipping in passenger liners is the dreadnoughts in a dress is probably the best way I can describe it, which is that you're seeing now what I will say, sorry, also just slightly separately, is what happens with some of these ships is that luxury liners, they do it a little bit with royal families' private yachts as well. The military will test out technology that they can covertly, particularly engine speed, etc. The Russian Navy, for instance, tries a new kind of engine in the Tsar's new private yacht. And actually, they think that's probably why it was made so soon after the last one. But and because also a lot of people will not, foreign governments won't be spying on luxury liners that you're putting this new technology into. And Britain really does that with a ship called the Mauretania that was the fastest that they built. But what is happening with these companies, and particularly the British and German companies, is that they start doing a kind of constant one-upmanship. And it's almost like, if you think of them as neighbors, one of them gets a nice new garden ornament. The next one then decides, well, I'm going to redo the driveway. Then someone adds on a new conservatory. And that's what they're doing. So in 1897, Germany really feels Britannia's ruled the waves long enough, militarily and commercially, and they bring out a luxury liner called Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse, named after the Kaiser's grandfather. And it's the first with the 4 funnels that we think of as intrinsically linked to the idea of luxury liners. And then they bring out 3 more, all named after members of the German imperial family. And Britain is stunned, really stunned by this. I mean, they didn't really think anyone else could do it but them. That does seem to have been the level of shock. And so the British, in this extraordinary moment, Parliament agrees to subsidize a private company, the Cunard Line, to build ships that are faster and larger than the German passenger liners, the largest, the imperial ones. And so the Lusitania and the Mauretania are born. They have to be built by British firms. The technology goes past the military. They get subsidized running costs as well, not just building costs. And left out slightly in the cold is our friend who's climbed into bed with capitalism, the White Star Line, who is still technically a British company. The ships are British, but the shares have been bought by JP Morgan and his shipping conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine. And what the military can do, big money can do even better. And so to combat the threat from these Cunard sisters, White Star is given a huge amount of money by their parent company, IMM with JP Morgan, to build ships that will retaliate to every kind of rival. And so that is how the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic come into being. These 3 ships that are going to be half again as big as the Cunard ships. And so really they are the result, the Titanic is the result of a weaving together of diplomatic tensions and capitalist competition at the same time. But I mean, certainly for me, watching that kind of Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse versus Mauretania tension, it does just seem like a dress rehearsal for the First World War. Those tensions, the complete lack of trust there.
Would it be overstating it to say that more than 100 years later, the sinking of the Titanic and its construction and its leadership and its aftermath are still very controversial subjects?
Yeah, it's not overstating it at all. And part of that goes back to your first question, which is, has it become part of lore? And people become wedded in history to stories. We become wedded to a version of events. And the Titanic has become, on the one hand, the morality tale. It's often used in Christian sermons as an example of the arrogance of man against
the hubris of man.
the hubris. It's essentially it's the Tower of Babel at sea. That's what the Titanic is in those sermons. It's also used very much as a warning against the dangers of capitalism. It's used allegedly as a metaphor for the cruelty of the rich. I mean, it's a politicized and theological metaphor. But the Titanic has also become, I think, fairly tenuously, if you look at the actual evidence, but the Titanic has become the leading star in a litany of conspiracy theories, and there's dozens of them. And what's interesting is, I mean, I like to speculate outside of the book. I can do this. This is part of the joy of doing part of the joy of doing things like this. But I'm always really interested in the intellectual acrobatics people perform to try to find this is the reason it sank. Or there was a fire burning too strongly in the engine rooms, the steel, the rudder, the rivets. It was deliberately sunk as an insurance fraud. It was deliberately sunk because someone wanted to start the Federal Reserve. All these things, and they try.
Spangle, did you hear that? That's right up your alley.
Yeah, you put a bit of ice there and hope someone hits it. But I think you have all of these many theories trying to find a reason why it sank. And I still think there's an element of us that is unconsciously, collectively running from this bone-chilling lesson that the Titanic gives you, which is, I argue in the book, there was nothing really deficient in its construction. There's nothing that the Titanic really did apart from go too fast, which is no small thing. But really, I think all those conspiracy theories are trying to say this is why it sank, because the alternative, which I think is what happened, is you can build the best possible thing that you can. We can do that. And if nature decides to flick her arm across the table, she's going to knock down every piece we have. And that's the lesson I think all these conspiracy theories are unconsciously running from. That there is at the core, the Titanic is controversial because the message that it gives us is to some degrees one of hopelessness, which is, if you don't listen to the warnings about the potential impact that nature can have on you, you will lose. There's never been a struggle where nature didn't win.
Is the Titanic controversy fueled by the fact that it was branded as unsinkable?
That's a really good chicken and the egg question, because I know there are some historians who will say, really, the unsinkable thing, no one was saying that until after it sank, and it was so the breadcrumb trail towards it was that when it and its slightly smaller sister, the Olympic, were entered into service, an industry journal, sort of like Industry magazine, and when talking about the technology of the sister ships, it said if you close after the Titanic sank, obviously White Star Line really put stress on. There was a qualifier before unsinkable, and then other people said that there was that ran with the word unsinkable. I think the unsinkable element took off a little bit more after it sank, but I think your question still stands as correct, because the argument would be became so controversial because it was seen to be, as you say, technological hubris. And so that's why I think people really clung to that word unsinkable, because it was a reminder of the hubristic arrogance of man to think that they could ever build something that the sea couldn't sink.
The research for your book is phenomenal. And certainly the historiography of the Titanic is voluminous, to say the least. How did you decide which parts to include in your book and which parts to omit? Because I'm sure that for every word you wrote, there were 10 possible words you could have written.
That's true. And I'm going to be honest, there's probably an element of a theory of chaos. There were certain things that just didn't really fully track. as there were a lot of rabbit holes, if that makes sense. She would start things and then you would realize, oh, this doesn't really go anywhere for where this particular narrative needs to go. A problem or a challenge, I would say, the end, after the point where I started narrating the evacuation. I had moved on from these 6 principal figures I was looking at, and everyone's on deck together. You have 2,000 stories kind of together. So in some senses, basically, I had to be slightly ruthless and say, if this doesn't prove a point, the story's not going in, and that ultimately was how I progressed. There were certain bits where I think there were about 3 stories in the chapter about rescue, which if I'm honest, was probably the most personally distressing research. The rescue mission was, when people started to realize who was dead and how that they were bereaved, was awful. But there were certain stories I put into that where I said, this is just so tragic, and I don't see where else this is going to fit in other history, so I'm going to put it in here, because I think sometimes I was very conscious of that some of these stories hadn't been told before.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing a phenomenal book called The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era. Our guest is Gareth Russell. I want to make sure I talk about this a little bit because it's the frame of reference for so many people. What did you think of the 1997 movie, The Titanic, that won all these awards and really brought Titanic mania, for lack of the better term, into popular culture? I don't necessarily want you to dissect it, but as a piece of art, it's a terrific movie. Just
Yeah, look, I will be. I should stand by my own earlier comments. This is not a dig at the movie. I hate the character of Rose as a moviegoer. I find her beyond insufferable. And I once said on Instagram, I will not retract it, that that there are 10. I sort of have a post of 10 reasons why Rose DeWitt-Paquette is a terrible person, and I stand by it. As a movie, I wasn't overly invested in the love story, which makes me sound heartless, but I sometimes don't think the movie fully gets the credit it deserves for the set, because essentially more or less every detail that you see of the set is accurate. I mean, they use some of the original plans from Harland and Wolff, and it is like looking at 1912 come to life. Some bits of the script are a bit wobbly, but generally speaking, I think it is a really beautiful, well acted epic, and to me, it's like an old Hollywood film. It really is. It's long. It's an extraordinary visual feast. So in that sense, I think you can tell Cameron's love for the Titanic as the ship, because really it is kind of the third character.
It's opulent, is how I always. You
that's the perfect word.
You go overseas and see some of these castles or cathedrals or manors or whatever. You just can't possibly imagine. My kids and I took them to Versailles about 4 years ago, and I said, forget every beautiful building you've ever seen in your life, because you're not going to be thinking about them while you're in here. And they just were, their mouths were agape, and they were just looking up the whole time, like, how can this be? And I thought that Cameron's cinematography and his treatment of it's almost reverential. Like, this is a time in our history. This is a time in our history that is long past, and we're going to honor it by telling stories, but we're also going to honor it visually by bringing you into a world that is long gone.
That's a really beautiful way to look at it, because I do think that's perfect. Actually, I love that, because I think what it does is that there is an element of it being a love, as much as it rinses the values of the Edwardian era, and I do think there's a little bit sort of modern values, as there are with all movies in it. One of the things I still think it has is that it's a love letter to 1912 in a strange way, and reverential is the perfect way to describe it. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful movie,
especially because just a few years after 1912, the whole world turns
That's it
upside
all
down.
gone. And that's sort of the point. I mean, that is probably something I was grappling with in the book, which is that they're all standing on the edge of a world that's about to, they're in the last mile of this world's existence.
In any reading of, to me, when I read about World War II, the war itself and how it was fought and the leadership and the courage of the men is kind of the subject matters that I find most compelling.
Yeah.
For World War I, it's the lead up to it, because it's like a car wreck and you're like, oh God, don't do this.
Yeah.
Just don't do this. And I get a little bit of that when it comes to the Titanic running into the iceberg. Like, just turn, just make a different decision, do something else. And it doesn't do it.
Well, that's why I kind of carried on. I mean, partly because I was discussing the people who I focus on, the survivors amongst them, what happens and how the war impacts them. But I do think that there's a clear parallel. This idea, and to the degree also that between Franz Ferdinand's assassination and the outbreak of the war, there was this strange period where no one really seemed to realize that it was all over and that the war was going to come. And in the same way, the Titanic had about 50 minutes, like 50 to 55 after the iceberg, where no one really clocked that it was over, that they were all in mortal danger. And I also, I mean, I mentioned this really briefly, but when I was looking at some accounts of the high society season of 1914, particularly if you look at the Russian one, but generally speaking, of the high society parties across Europe in 1914, there's a recurring trend in the memoirs that this was the season, that the parties had never been better, the picnics had never happened on sunnier days, the balls had never been greater. And the Titanic survivors do that about the Sunday that it sank. The dinner was the best dinner of the trip. The sky was gorgeous. And I think that in both elements, the memoirists are indulging sort of an emotional nostalgia, because it becomes the best because it's the last in their memory, and the ship is about to sink.
And in so many histories, whether it's Barbara Tuchman's or I don't know, I've read probably about 15 to 20 books on the beginning of World War I. Most of them, The Pity of War is a really good one. The Sleepwalkers is another terrific book. They talk about, Europe's actually, after years of not getting along, Europe's actually getting along in 1914. Things are better than they have been for a while. And you could make the argument that the metaphor for the Titanic is, we finally, the third class cabin steerage on this ship is actually better than most places second class. And it's interesting enough that the Titanic wasn't full, which I didn't know until I read your book. I thought it was completely full, and it wasn't even close, as I recall.
Correct.
But the Titanic was kind of the apogee of the pre-war luxury class. And so many of the people who were on the Titanic died. And then so many people who survived the Titanic were then ravaged by World War I. Yeah,
it's interesting. And that's, I mean, you think they survived this in April 1912. There's 2 years and a little bit until the war comes. And there is a pathology of tragedy that shoots through the early 20th century. Because if you have this figure survive the Titanic, then there's the First World War. And if they survive that, then there's the Great Depression. And if they survive that, then there's the rise of fascism. And if they survive that, then there's the Second World War. And it's just this sort of, I don't know if you're familiar. I think it's in, I can't remember which Indiana Jones movie this is in. Where is the one where he switches the idol at the start? Is it The Last Crusade?
Well, the very first one where he switches the idol and then
the boulder.
And then the boulder, that's the first. Right. That's Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. So, which was actually when I watched the most as a kid. Yeah, that to me is like the 20th century for a lot of people. It's just this boulder bearing down on you, and you're constantly, and some of you outrun it, but it just feels like they're always running from something for the really from about 1912 to say about 1945. And interestingly, one of the figures that I looked at, Jack Thayer, who was born as sort of East Coast American old money, in his memoirs, and he writes this in the 40s, and I don't think that's coincidental. Looking back from the 1940s, Jack Thayer pinpoints the Titanic. I think he probably overstates the Titanic's role in this historically, but not emotionally. And he says that's the day the Edwardian era ended, because every certainty we had shattered. And from then on, from the day the Titanic sank, it just seemed to him as if the world was getting faster and faster and faster, and more unsettled. And so I do think that after the Titanic, there is a sense of a shattering of certainty, that the First World War is that times 1,000. I think a lot of people say Europe was getting on better than it had for a very long time. I think a lot of people thought, as with the point about unsinkable that you made, I think a lot of people thought that war was unthinkable between the European great powers by that stage, and again they were wrong.
You mentioned the Edwardian era.
Yeah,
that's obviously named after Edward VII, the son of Queen Victoria. I think he's king. Was it 1901 to 1910?
Yes, correct.
And he's fondly known to history as Edward the Caresser.
Yes, he was a ladies' man.
So talk about the Edwardian age. It really was kind of the apogee of British power in the world.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. They were certainly an arbiter of peace while being a colonizing power. They had reckoned with the rise of the United States, and basically 100 plus years of antipathy had pretty much gone away by this point between the two countries. Brother Jonathan, as we were called by our British cousins. But what was the Edwardian age, and why you said it ended? And did it end because of the sinking of the Titanic, or because of the reaction to the sinking?
Oh, I think it ended because of the reaction. I think what's really interesting about the Edwardian period, as you say, Edward VII dies in 1910. But we don't have a proper name for that period between his death and the start of the war. And many people really just see the Edwardian period as the long Edwardian period, and that the attitudes continue until 4 years. The world continues 4 years after his death. I would say the attitudes endure for about 2.5 years after his death. And I do think the sinking of the Titanic and the reaction to it is what starts it's the first blow against the Edwardian era's confidence. That's the governing mood of the Edwardian period. It's confidence that things are going to continue getting better. And even, you mentioned sort of the element of colonialism and imperialism. And what's interesting is that you do have in Britain at the time this might be a misnomer or a contradiction in terms. There's a rising group of people called the liberal imperialists who are not comfortable at all with the empire, and they believe that the empire is getting to the point where it's going to wither out of existence, and that basically you're looking at even people who support the empire or disagree with the empire believe that whatever the future holds is going to be better. Obviously, they have different versions of what that is. You have people like the suffragette cause who really and truly believe that the world is going to get better for women and for their cause. You have a lot of people involved in Jewish rights in Britain who have great confidence that the kind of persecutions you're seeing against the Jewish communities in Russia are a dwindling factor in history. And all of them, regardless of where they stand on issues like empire or civil rights or the extension of the vote, nearly all of them are united by this belief that technology is going to make the world a better place. And in many ways, up until about 1912, that faith is justified. You have seen extraordinary advances in the field of medicine. And of course, in communication, the fact that you can send telegrams across the Atlantic or from ships as they're crossing the Atlantic, the fact that it's possible to travel from, to get on a train in London at night, go into your little bedroom, fall asleep and wake up in Scotland, where before that would have taken a week. The world is shrinking and becoming more accessible. and more hopeful because of technology. That's the pervasive view. What they don't seem to have clocked is that technology always gives with one hand and takes away from the other. And they're not looking at the ways in which these strides in technology are also being applied to warfare and to military technology. And the warning sign for Europe should have been the American Civil War. They should have seen what things like the changes in weaponry did there, and they weren't paying any attention to it. But broadly speaking, there is a confidence that the world is going to get richer. There's a confidence that society is going to become more harmonious, and that life is going to become sweeter and longer because of technology. And then all of a sudden, the world wakes up on April the 15th, 1912, to the news that not only was technology completely incapable of stopping nearly 1,500 people drowning or freezing to death in the middle of the Atlantic, but to some degrees, technology was largely responsible for that tragedy, that the ship was too large to turn in time and that it was going too fast because there was too much confidence in its technology. So I think that confidence in progress in technology is shattered by the Titanic, firstly because it couldn't stop a tragedy, which a lot of Edwardians thought it had. And in fact, it caused a tragedy to some degree, which Edwardians certainly did not think was a possibility. And then 2 years later, you have that magnified 1,000 times over, when the technology aspect of things is precisely what makes the First World War so much longer and more deadly than any war that had happened on the European continent beforehand.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is Gareth Russell. He wrote The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic, and the End of the Edwardian Era. With all tragedies, there are myths. Did you find some more compelling than others? And do you think that you dispelled one or two in your book about the Titanic?
I think there were some that were so entrenched and have acquired such emotional weight that I had to be sensitive and sensible about the way I deconstructed them when the evidence suggests that they aren't correct. I mean, I'll be honest, from the perspective of a reader and a writer, I'm always slightly wary and weary of compulsive mythbusters, people who go in, bust a myth and tear it apart. I think that's you starting with where you want to get to, not where the evidence is going to take you. And right. So I was cautious when there were some myths that turned up that, to me, the evidence really led in another way. The one that springs to mind most obviously is probably one of the most entrenched, which is that the third-class passengers were deliberately kept below to prevent them.
You have anticipated my next question. You go right ahead.
Oh, good. And I'm sorry. I kind of hate it when people do that to me.
No, you're fine.
That was probably the one that stood out the most to me, as because what you don't want to say is, you don't want to look like you're trying to downplay the tragedy of the loss of life, and you have to but you also have to factor in things like the work of statisticians and historians who've said gender was a bigger factor to who lived and who died than class. I think they probably combined together. But really, the idea that the third class were deliberately kept below is completely untrue. And the reason for the higher death toll was partly because there were a lot more men traveling in third class. The other reason that was a lot that really, and this is probably the one regret I have about the book, I think I should have been a lot harder on Captain Smith than I was when I reread it. But the captain did not tell the crew who dealt with the passengers that the ship was sinking. And the third class public rooms were at the back of the ship. So the last bit of the ship where it became physically clear as it tilted downwards that something was wrong with the Titanic. And there were crew there who were completely unaware that this was an evacuation situation, that actually you needed to get as many people off as possible. And also because of US quarantine laws at the time, the physical layout of the ship was designed to keep first and second class separate from third. And that was in consequence of a cholera epidemic at an emigration port in Germany 20 years earlier. And since then, there had been a rule that third class had to be kept separate in terms of socializing, really. And otherwise, everyone had to go through Ellis Island when they arrived. And obviously, first class passengers and second class didn't. That's part of what they were paying, was to avoid that. And so that's why if you look at the Titanic, where the first and second class could promenade or take the air, their decks were right next to each other, separated by a very low fence. Third class were quite a bit back on the stern. And that all combined to mean that the Titanic was not designed to get the third class up easily to the boat deck, which was where the first and second class passengers walked. And one of the things that I left with was, first of all, had the third class passengers been deliberately kept below, the casualties would actually be higher. But also, when you I'm not articulating this perfectly, but I think once you stop seeing it as this sort of monstrous idea of them being pinned down by callous stewards, there's something even more horrifying and repugnant about the merging together or weaving together of accidental, mundane factors that contributed to a higher death cause. And that probably to me is a better lesson to take from it, which is that if you don't anticipate a catastrophe in the way White Star Line did not in any way anticipate a catastrophe when they designed the Titanic, then you are laying the groundwork for something horrific, like the particularly much higher death toll for third class men. Although I should point out, actually, I hope my statistics are right here, but I don't think there was the second class death toll for percentage for men was very low as well. Very high, as well.
One of the points that comes through in your book, which I thought was interesting, is that the whole notion of women and children first, and how it exacerbated or made the male death toll higher.
Yeah, that was one thing that I had not anticipated finding when I went into it, but there was a lot of contemporary criticism after the sinking from more skeptical, from a couple of survivors, but also from, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, was the first who said this was insanity. The policy of women and children first was insane when you consider that there were a lot more men traveling on the Titanic than there were women. Part of the reason for that is that it was still generally a custom among immigration from Western Europe to the United States for men to go ahead first and to sort of set up a home or a job, and then their wife, fiance, or children would follow. And obviously, generally because of Edwardian attitudes towards gender and society, it was still fairly rare, not unheard of, but it was less common for women to travel on their own. Right. So for a variety of reasons, there were many more men on board. And also, I should point out the crew. With the crew, they outnumbered the women. I think it was, it's not even 9-1 really. But the point that George Bernard Shaw and other people like Lucy Duff Gordon tried to make was, there were so many more men, and a lot of the lifeboats were leaving half full because a lot of them stood back and were told either they couldn't get in or felt embarrassed to get in. And as a result, there was a definite stage in the evacuation where the lifeboats were leaving 1/3, 1/5, half full, because there weren't women nearby, or the particular part of that deck where the lifeboat was leaving from, there were more men standing by. And Shaw felt very strongly that after the sinking, there had been an almost unconscious collective desire to eulogize the women and children only rule as nobility and chivalry, when in fact it had been dim-witted stupidity, and no one could bring themselves to admit that that rule had contributed to so many needless deaths. Now, I should point out that George Bernard Shaw kind of entered into as a bit of a public spat. Today, we'd be seeing, taglines like George Bernard Shaw owns Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle slams George Bernard Shaw. But Arthur Conan Doyle, who, of course, wrote the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, Arthur Conan Doyle really took George Bernard Shaw to task with this and said, if we hadn't done that, we could have had more children that died. And that George Bernard Shaw had many gifts, but decency and kindness weren't one of them. And so I think, certainly there were people who disagreed very strongly with Bernard Shaw and Duff Gordon and said that no, the women and children rule was right.
On the deck of the Titanic, the lifeboat is 50% full.
Yeah.
You got a chance to jump on it or stay there.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Well, I don't know. I should say I have a potent sense of shame. And so I am probably the kind of person who would have held back. And there's very few things in which I will step out of line. But that actually, interestingly, you sort of asked and answered a question that I always try to answer by asking, which is partly why the Titanic remains so fascinating, which is that the Titanic took those 2 hours and 40 minutes that it took to sink. In doing so, it allows you to imagine what you would have done. That's that. I think the mortality play becomes the morality play. You get to imagine what you would have done standing on the deck of the Titanic. And it's interesting. I think everyone likes to think they would be, Lightoller or Colonel Gracie fighting to free the lifeboats, but you don't know. And I suppose part of what a lot of the survivors struggled with is that their survival was a test of character that some of them felt they didn't pass. And that's, I think, that was part of the tragedy, that a lot of them, I think, quite unfairly lived with guilt for the rest of their lives.
Let's jump right into that, because I got 3 folks I want to ask you about.
Hit me.
First is J. Bruce Ismay, otherwise known as J. Bruce Ismay, who is definitely, I would say, other than the iceberg, the greatest villain of the Titanic story.
Sure.
Who was he? How did he become a villain?
Yeah.
And what do you think of his historical reputation and how he was treated contemporaneously? Where I think William Randolph Hearst pointed am I getting this right? He printed a list of everyone who died. He hated Ismay. They had a falling out, hated him, printed a list of everyone who died, and then printed a list of everyone who survived, except he only printed one name, and that was Bruce Ismay.
Yeah. So he was taken down by the future Citizen Kane. And so look, one of the things I will say is that when you're trying to redeem someone, temper someone's reputation, you don't have to make them a saint. Bruce Ismay had many feelings as a character. I don't imagine I would have wanted to go out for a drink with him or sit across from him in the restaurant on the Titanic. That would not have been something I would be keen to do. He was theatrically full of self-pity, an emotional masochist. I mean, he absolutely loathed himself, and that became very clear in some letters I found and included in the book. He was, I think, an intensely awkward person. He was kind of ritually humiliated by his father, who founded the White Star Line Company. And Ismay was on board without his wife. The marriage was sort of disintegrating. And he helped with the evacuation. And what's interesting is there are multiple accounts that one of the officers, either the chief officer or the first officer, shouted at him, "Get the boat." because there was no one else on the deck at the particular time when he famously jumped into the lifeboat. But Ismay was low. I mean, his life was ruined. I mean, his life was absolutely destroyed. He, friends slammed doors in his face. He was publicly castigated at the American inquiry more than the British inquiry. And certainly if you look at, I mean, if you go back to the James Cameron movie, he is unquestionably the villain in that. He is the one who urges the captain to go faster, which the real Ismay doesn't seem to have done. He is the one who really is cast as the patient zero.
Yeah, do you get the sense he's the personification of capitalism?
Oh yeah, he is. He's the effete. He's the effete, smug face of capitalism. He is the man who makes the mess and then runs away from it. Part of to answer your question about his historical reputation, it's because he lives, really. There's no one else. He's the highest ranking public figure that survives. The captain is dead. The designer is dead. Many of the crew, the senior officers, are the chief officer and the first officer are dead. Ismay is alive. And there needed to be someone to take the blame for this. And it's him. And look, and Ismay does not help himself because, as I say, an intensely awkward man. And he answers questions at the inquiry in this seemingly cold way. Ismay really, really does not help himself when it comes to public relations. In the same way that Hearst, his rival, is a genius at knowing how to manipulate the public, Ismay is a complete innocent. I mean, to the point of a buffoon when it comes to trying to make people like him. Ismay to me was I cannot stress this enough. There is no way Ismay was urging Smith to go faster or to ignore the ice warning. Smith didn't need urge to do that. But I think, really what the inquiry found with Ismay, which I think is probably a fair point, is that maybe him being on board made Smith feel a bit more hubristic. I don't buy that. Some of the interviews I found of Captain Smith earlier in his career, I felt to hear a captain say shipwrecks are a thing of the past 10 years before the Titanic sank is mind-blowing. But Ismay, I think, was probably a quite unlikable man, but not a villainous one at all, and certainly not the monstrous embodiment of megalomaniacal money grabbing as he seems to be in a lot of popular perceptions of the Titanic.
In James Cameron's Titanic, he's the man with the fabulous mustache who goes, "Yeah, this ship can't sink."
Yeah, that mustache is so fantastic. It looks like he should be twirling it as he ties Lily and Gish to the train tracks.
Well, he said he emerges as the villain. So let me ask you about someone who clearly emerges as a hero, and that is Thomas Andrews.
Yes.
Brilliantly portrayed in the James Cameron movie as this very smart yet very real and human engineer, which is an interesting combination. But Thomas Andrews does not survive.
No.
Why does he, do you think he chose his death at that time?
I can't say that for certainty. What I can be more confident in of any of them who chose to stay, it's Andrews, because Cecil Fitzpatrick, who was a waiter in the first class restaurant, was near him just before the final plunge, and Fitzpatrick says that Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews were talking, and Smith was trying to urge Andrews to put on a life jacket and jump because there was nothing else anyone could do. One of the interesting things that I think one of the most memorable moments, you see it in the movie A Night to Remember in 1958 and in the Titanic movie in 1997, is Andrew standing in the first class smoking room looking at the painting as the ship sinks. And that did happen, but it wasn't the last. He seemed to have about a 10-minute space out, if that's the right word. And he stared at the painting. Then he went back out and started throwing things overboard for people to use as life rafts. He had gone through the ship trying to, check, make sure everyone was up on deck. He'd been putting stewardesses and passengers into the lifeboats. Thomas Andrews was a man of vital utility. He really believed that the way you were good was to be useful. And Andrews, I often want, as much as I find him, one of the most admirable characters I've written about, I do wonder what would have happened had he lived. Because I imagine the questions about the design flaws might have been flung at him in the way they ended up being flung at Ismay. I don't know what the answer to that is, because I imagine Andrews might have been redeemed slightly by the fact that every ship in the world at the time had those design flaws. None of them could possibly have withstood a blow as large as the Titanic suffered when it hit the iceberg. In fact, none of them would have stayed afloat for as long as the Titanic did if they'd had nearly 1/3 of their width intermittently opened to the Atlantic beneath the waterline. So I think he could have been saved by the fact the ship lasted. Even Andrews was surprised by how long it lasted. He told Smith that the ship had about 90 minutes left, and it ended up having 160. So I think he could possibly have been saved by that, but I don't know if he wanted to be saved. Look, he lived a couple of streets over from where I live in Belfast, and he had a little daughter there, Elizabeth, and he loved his wife very much. He was a real family man, and very homesick when he was away. But from everything I have heard of Thomas Andrews and all the research I did and some of the accounts of people who knew him in 1912 and beforehand, he was a man who really emphatically believed in sticking to your duty to the end and doing your job. And so, did he choose his death? I can't answer that certainly. What I can say is he did not make any effort to save himself ahead of anybody else.
You mentioned Captain Edward Smith a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
In the movie, he's portrayed as this, typical stoic, duty bound.
Sure.
And then they actually show him dying in the movie, obviously, as he's at his post. Did you come away, your research, did you come away with the same impression?
No, not at all. I went into, and that what I stand by. I think I was too soft on Smith in the book a little bit, partly because, you're human. I suppose part of what I'm looking at, you feel like you're kicking a dog or something. That's not the right term. You feel like you're kicking someone who's already on the ground when it's such a tragic death. Right. And I think Smith had many fine qualities, but I do think that there was a very quiet but potent arrogance there. And I did not have that opinion of him going into the book, and I really had to come to it quite reluctantly. As I say, when you're reading interviews of him saying in 1903, shipwrecks don't happen anymore, they're a thing of the past. And you think to yourself, if you have that view in 1903, when the largest ships are about 22,000, how confident are you going to be in how you navigate a ship 10 years later that's 46,000? And there were comments that I found from first-class passengers who were at an after-dinner concert with him on the Titanic about 2 days before the collision, when he tells them, you don't need to worry, this ship could be trifurcated, this ship could be cut in 3 and it would still float. And obviously he was being sort of, playfully hyperbolic there, but everything I found led me to think this was a man who had such overweening confidence in technology, in the strides of nautical technology across his career, that it has to have bled into the decisions he made in how he ran those ships. And once you take Ismay out of the equation, and once you are prepared to accept that the evidence does not, that it will be unheard of for a managing director to tell there's a very strict hierarchy at sea, very strict, and sailors take it very seriously, and this was a steamship company. Once you take out of the equation Ismay being the puppet master, and Smith sort of being like the benign Santa Claus at sea as he's regularly presented, you're left with a very fallible and believable character who had too much faith in the technology he'd seen, who made some really egregiously terrible decisions about how he navigated the Titanic. When you are receiving ice warning after ice warning from the ships passing you, saying there's a big ice field ahead, and you don't slow down. In fact, you're planning to speed up the next day to test the boilers. You have to say, in all fairness, that there was an extreme dereliction of caution before the collision with the iceberg, and after the collision with the iceberg, there was a dereliction of duty because, as I've said, he did not impart the seriousness of the situation to the crew, which meant that the crew were not evacuating the passengers with the efficiency and urgency that they should have. So, and I try to say in the book, and I do still stand by this, I do think that there are ameliorating circumstances. Firstly, it was perceived nautical wisdom at the time that the only thing you slowed really big ships down for was fog. And the ships were so strong that the best thing to do was to get them through an ice field as quickly as you could, which seems utterly insane in the aftermath of the Titanic. And I should point out that there was a rear admiral in the US fleet, I think called Chadwick. I mean, a ridiculously wasp name. The man was like Frederick Esnor Chansnick or something. I mean, really, kind of like an East Hampton name. And but he did say, no, that's not standard. That is a view held by some people, but it's lunatic not to slow down when you're told there's a massive number of icebergs ahead of you. The other extenuating circumstance, I would say, in regard to the evacuation, is that I do truly believe that Smith was concerned about panic, about causing panic. And to that point, I'll give I can't put myself in his position, but I do think I kept the gloves on a little bit with Smith in the book, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you err on the side of caution and kindness, but I do think he made some truly horrendous decisions that he was not there to take the blame for. So Ismay ended up taking that blame in the inquiries. I will also say that Smith did not die at his post. Cecil Fitzpatrick it is very clear, as are other people on the deck, that he jumped or was washed overboard during a particular moment where the ship suddenly dipped. It was not required of him to go down with the ship. The kind of de facto suicide at sea is more of a myth. Basically, once you get to the point where there's nothing else the captain can do, abandon ship, every man for himself, that's the point he could go. And I do believe I can't say whether he jumped or was swept overboard, but it's very clear from what Cecil Fitzpatrick saw that Smith was trying to get Thomas Andrews at least, to consider saving himself. And I think that was the point at which Smith vanishes from the records, sadly.
We have a few more minutes with Gareth Russell, the author of The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic, and the End of the Edwardian Era. I'm going to mention three more villains who aren't who's, they're its. If you want to give me just a minute or two on those.
Sure.
First one is the lifeboats. The second one is the rudder on the Titanic, which is blamed, I think, specifically in the movie. And the third villain is SS California. Californian. SS California.
So the lifeboats, great question. This is another one that kind of changed my mind as I went through it. First of all, there weren't enough for everyone on board, but it probably wouldn't have made much difference if there had been, because there wasn't time to launch them all. They were still trying to launch the last four emergency craft, admittedly, when the ship entered its final plunge. Some of the lifeboats actually went off upside down. So really, the lifeboats, I would argue that, and this is obviously not insignificant, I think if they had more lifeboats, they probably would have been able to save about another 100 or 150 lives maybe 200 in the limited parameters that were left with the time. But ultimately, there was not enough time between the call to the boats and the final plunge, or the point at which the Titanic entered into a really rapid final descent, after which launching the lifeboats became impossible. So the lifeboats ultimately would not have made they would not, even if there had been enough for everyone would not have lived.
But they had more lifeboats. Am I correct in remembering that they had more lifeboats than they needed to have?
Yeah, they
That
did.
was required by law.
They had less than Thomas Andrews had recommended that they have. They had more than the law required them to have. So the Board of Trade Regulations in the United Kingdom at the time, and this is an indicator of the rapid advances in maritime technology, they were out of date because of how much the ship's sizes had changed, but they measured it in tonnage, and anything 10,000 and above had to have 16 lifeboats. The Titanic was 46,000 tons. And but they had 20. They had marginally more than they were required to. Thomas Andrews and Alexander Carlisle, his predecessor at Harland and Wolff, had suggested more. I should point out there were some naval experts afterwards who said the Titanic has led people to think that lifeboats will save everyone if there are enough, and there aren't. And sometimes double stacking the lifeboats can cause hazards during evacuation, something that did become clear in the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and the sinking of the Britannic in 1916, when the ships kind of veered over on their side and the top row collapsed into some of the bottom row of lifeboats. So there were problems with the overstacking of lifeboats that happened after the Titanic, but yes, they had more than they were required to, less than they were advised to.
Rudder.
Poor rudder. So poor rudder. The rudder was marginally smaller than it would need to be for 2023 requirements, to the best of my knowledge, but it was not a sort of limp fin at the back of the ship by any stretch of the imagination. It was not, even had the rudder been a bit bigger, it wouldn't have made enough of a difference to save it. The night, really, the lack of a moon that night was a big problem, but their speed was the biggest problem. So the rudder really wasn't as big. Ironically, the small rudder wasn't as big of a problem as it's been made out to be.
And finally, the SS Californian.
Robert, you just absolutely threw me into a landmine as we leave.
We were talking about how controversial this is.
I know, but I tried to dance through that no man's land in the book. Okay, yes. So the Californian was a small ship that was near the Titanic. How near is contested. And the argument is that the Californian had turned off her wireless at night, had stopped because of the ice, and didn't turn on the wireless, and could have saved the passengers on the Titanic had the wireless on, or if its officers hadn't, I don't know, mistaken the distress rockets for a fireworks display, which again, insane. But I don't know I do know where I stand on the Californian. I do think it was there. Some people have said that there potentially was another ship nearby that was illegally there, and that it was the ship people saw in the distance from the Titanic. It's not an insane idea. It just doesn't fully convince me. A more interesting idea is that the captain of the Californian, Stanley Lord, allegedly was quite draconian. And because he was asleep, the officers seeing the distress rockets weren't sure what they were. And so they didn't want to wake him because they feared his temper. That's potentially true.
It's what killed Stalin.
Yeah, it's I don't know if I'm absolutely honest. I don't know if I think the Californian probably was close. I think again, though, it was following a fairly standard protocol. It was a tiny ship. I actually don't know if it could have taken that many people on board. But anyway, it was a tiny ship. It did have the wireless off. They have to have seen something, even if there was another smaller ship nearby. I don't necessarily believe there was. But even if there was, the Californian officers have to have seen something that indicated that there was a big ship near, not really nearby, but nearby enough that they could see maybe rockets going off or something. But I again think I think the Californian's a bit like Ismay, if I'm totally honest. I think There were probably mistakes made on board the Californian that night. I think I think people were reaching around desperately to find any kind of reason that could extenuate the tragic circumstances of what had happened in the Titanic. And so they were so angry at anyone who had quote unquote inappropriately survived, like Bruce Ismay, or they were looking for someone to blame. And that's when they landed on the Californian. And again, regardless of what you think of his temper or whatever, Stanley Lord's life was destroyed by this speculation that he was the man who slept through the sinking of the Titanic and could have saved hundreds of lives. So I do think it was nearby. I don't think it can really be held culpable. The reasons for the tragedy of the Titanic happened on the Titanic, not on the Californian.
So then, other than missing the iceberg, how could the scope of the tragedy have been avoided? Both the sinking and the aftermath. I mean, God puts you on the Titanic 2 hours before it hits it hits the iceberg at what, 11 something, I think, at night.
Yeah, 11:40. Yeah.
So how could all of this drama have been avoided other than, okay, we're just going to steer the ship 50 feet in a different direction?
There isn't any. That's the chilling part of it. And I think we're always still looking for what could have been done. What could have you're maybe talking about saving a couple hundred lives if the lifeboat evacuation had been better organized. Or maybe if the Californian had turned on its wireless, but the full 1,496 who died, I don't think they all could have been saved. And I think many ways, and we're scrabbling around for different reasons, it's to avoid, there's something chilling and terrifying about dread inevitability. And I think the minute the ice made contact with the hull, that was it. I think that other people disagree with me. Some have good theories as to why they disagree with me, but I think the minute the first rivet popped out because of the iceberg, it was that the tragedy had started, and that there was nothing that you could do. You could soften different bits of it by, Smith telling the crew it's sinking, get them up. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe you could have saved potentially 350 more lives. No small feat by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't see anything that could have been done from the minute it hit the iceberg that all 1,496 people would have been saved.
And this is not a fair question, which we specialize in those here.
Sure.
Leaders and Legends podcast. So how do you chalk up if you had to apportion blame, bad luck, incompetence, God's will? How would you say that if you had to slice it up and give it a percentage, how you could do it?
I make a point of never trying to speak for God. I think he has enough people who
but you're Irish.
I know, but we've learned to listen, not speak. God's way. Do you know what? I think if you're gonna ask me incompetence and bad luck, it's a bit like a gin and tonic, really. I don't know what's going to make me sound like an alcoholic, because I was about to say it's 50-50. It's not. Do not make that gin and tonic. That's far too strong. No, I think it is 50-50, if I'm honest. I think it is a mixture of really bad luck. Things like the lack of moon that night, the milder winter in the Arctic in 1911, the fact that it was a growler iceberg, so they look darker anyway. The fact that it was a really calm night, there was no wind, so the waves weren't even breaking around the rim of the iceberg. So usually you can see like a white rim of waves. That wasn't there. I think everything that happened on that night was bad luck. I think in terms of incompetence, time and time again, it's the speed with which it was running. And it wasn't, as I say in the book, it wasn't trying to break the record for crossing the Atlantic. It technologically wasn't capable of it. They deliberately designed the Titanic to go a day slower than the Speed Queen, its rival, the Mauretania, because that way you could provide more amenities and you could get people there without, being more comfortable. And in fact, actually, some of the second class passengers who'd previously traveled Cunard said they would take the extra day because the ship wasn't rattling in the way the Speed Queens did as they raced across the Atlantic.
That's interesting, because it comes through in your book how important luxury and comfort was to the builders of it, and obviously to the passengers.
Totally. I mean, look, if someone's going to say to you, do you want to kind of tremble slightly for 5 days, or do you want to get there in comfort in 6? I would take the 6. And certainly that's what White Star marketed themselves as. Not the fastest, not the slowest either, but not the fastest, but certainly the most comfortable. You know, it was steady over speedy was really the motto. And in that regards, 100%. I mean, I think that it wasn't trying to break the speed record, but it was trying to test its engines. And that's what Smith was doing. And to not slow down when you have that many ice warnings to me is incompetent, really incompetent. And so it's a 50-50 mix of circumstance and very, very poor human decisions. Circumstance and context, I guess, is the or circumstance and incompetence, as she said. That's the mix.
One of the things, and this is my last question or comment. I want you to just take a few minutes to chat about it. I believe this was in your book and not in any of the other articles I read to prepare for this podcast. But this was a pretty common route for ships to travel.
Yeah.
And in the days, or the day or whatever, after the Titanic sank, ships coming down this way could see dead bodies.
Yeah, there was they diverted some of them immediately. You know, one of the ships that left New York, say when the story broke, to change route. The ones that were en route didn't have time to do that. And then the anecdote, or the incident that's most bone-chilling, was a German luxury liner called the Bremen that first of all saw the iceberg. They saw red paint smeared across an iceberg in the distance. But first-class passengers were up on deck, and they looked down and they could see floating bodies. And several passengers on the Bremen fainted. It was so distressing. And that was just before the White Star Line had already hired a Canadian trawler to go out with teams of morticians, and a clergyman to go out and start recovering the bodies, bury at sea the ones that weren't, were too decomposed or damaged, and then bring back to Canada to arrange burial on the other ones, as many as they could find. And so there was a window of a few days when the Titanic dead were floating around the wreckage site, and there were ships, most memorably the Bremen, that saw them.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest has been Gareth Russell, author of The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era. I'm a book nerd, so I try to read as much as possible, and all I can tell you is, if you feel the same way, pick up books by Gareth Russell. I'm happy to give you a list if you email me. Gareth, you are a terrific historian, a wonderful writer, and a very gracious guest. I'm so happy to see you and hear you on the podcast again. I'm just very grateful.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. It's a great podcast to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.